2021 meeting of the Ames Zoning Board of Adjustment to order. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, holding in-person meeting tonight is impractical, and thus this meeting is being held by electronic means. The Zoning Board of Adjustment is a quasi-judicial board created by the City of Ames. The board's purpose is to decide on applications for home occupation permits, special use permits, exceptions, and variances to the zoning ordinance, applications for conditional use permits in the floodplain, requests for reasonable accommodation because of a handicap, and appeals of the decisions of the zoning enforcement officer. As a board of the city, we welcome all testimony. We make our decisions based on the facts and evidence as allowed under city code and presented in open meeting. Testimony before the board must be given under oath or affirmation. If the proceedings become lengthy, we may ask that testimony be focused on new facts or evidence not already presented. We ask that you push the raise your hand button on Zoom if you wish to speak, and a staff member will identify you to the board before unmuting you. Before testifying, please state your full name, spell your last name, and state your address. When you're testifying, please address your remarks to the board. We also ask that the proceedings be orderly. The Zoning Board of Adjustment is an independent volunteer board of citizens. We are not part of the city administration. We are served in our efforts by Jane Chang, Assistant City Attorney, Ray Anderson, City Planner, and who else am I missing? Renee Hall, Recording Secretary. The order of proceedings for each application will be as follows. First, an oral statement summarizing the issues and procedural steps will be presented by the staff. Second, testimony and evidence will be presented by the applicant. Third, testimony may be heard from any members of the audience who wish to speak in support of or in opposition to the appeal. Next, the board will give the applicant and the city staff an opportunity to present concluding summaries and arguments. And finally, the board will discuss the issues and evidence and come to a decision. Okay, approval of the minutes of the meeting of April 14th, 2021 is the first item on the agenda. Additions, changes?
Make a motion to approve. Second.
Great. Motion by Shapaw, second by Bowers. All those in favor say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Okay, and the minutes are approved. Next item on the agenda is a special use permit to allow a yard waste collection and transfer facility at 220 and 400 Friel Drive. Ray? Ray, I think you might be muted.
Sorry about that. And tonight we're talking about the special use permit to allow a yard waste collection and transfer facility at 220 and 400 Field Drive. At the last meeting, we talked about this same site, but in relation to an appeal, which I'll mention a little bit later. But tonight we're talking about the special use permit that was submitted on January 14th by Chamness Technology. And they propose to operate a yard waste collection transfer site at 220 and 400 Field Drive in the general industrial zoning district. There's no specific time limit that was proposed in the application requested by the applicant, but they do reference performance consistent with the city contract for yard waste disposal. And the proposed facility is not limited to use as a city facility. There is no site plan to review this evening with this application. At the last meeting, the Zoning Board of Adjustment granted an appeal of the planning director's decision that a site plan was not required for this temporary use. for a yard waste facility. And it's important to note that the appeal was only for the application step of the review and did not grant approval for use of this site, nor was it a variance to the zoning ordinance standards. In your report, you'll see information about how they plan to operate the site and the hours they will be open, and the plan for traffic circulation for the yard waste days. So I won't go through that in specifics. But I did want to point out a section in the zoning code, section 29.303, general zoning regulations, paragraph 1, land, buildings, and structures regulated is the title. No land, building, or structure shall be used, no building or structure shall be erected, and no existing building or structure shall be moved, added to, or altered except in conformity with this ordinance. There was some discussion at the last meeting about the word temporary, and that's not defined within the zoning ordinance. And as I mentioned, the applicant did not propose a specific end date for this use. Instead, it was described in relation to the city's contract. But as we look at this, even if the use operates for only the initial 3-year period of the city contract, it results in a total of 6+ years of operation at this site. And staff has found no basis to determine that the 6 years of use of the site can reasonably be viewed as temporary. There are no known examples of such a situation in Ames. The prior approvals for this use are the longest granted approvals as temporary that we have experienced. There are other somewhat similar situations for a 1-year authorization for cellular tower facilities and for an asphalt batch plant. And as discussed with the applicant earlier, legislative change by the city council to address their proposed use similar to batch plants is probably the most appropriate way to address their site improvement concerns. For a special use permit, there are certain standards that must be met. They're in Article 13 of Chapter 29 of the Municipal Code. And of those standards, there are 7 general standards. And staff found that there were 2 of the standards that we believe were not met. One is General Standard II. It says, be designed, constructed, operated, and maintained so as to be harmonious and appropriate in appearance with the existing and intended character of the general vicinity, and that such a use will not change the essential character of the area in which it is proposed. And one of our findings is that the applicant has not included a formal site plan needed for the installation of required paving of driveways and parking areas. Article 4 of the zoning ordinance requires the paving of all vehicular areas used for parking and maneuvering with a minimum paved surface of 5 inches of asphalt or concrete, or is otherwise authorized by the municipal engineer. This standard applies citywide in all zoning districts, including this zoning district, general industrial. Staff has identified that a minimum amount of driveway and parking pavement is needed for the regular use of the site as described by the applicant. The drop-off and storage areas on the site do not require paving, although surface stabilization may be done as needed for facilitating the large event days. So in conclusion, under standard II, we say without zoning ordinance development standards compliance that apply to all uses of land, the use is not harmonious in its design and construction with intended character of the area, because all new uses in this area are required to comply with the zoning standards. If the site included required improvements for its ongoing use, proposed yard waste disposal site is compatible with the other types of industrial uses that currently exist on Friel Drive. And then there's one other standard we felt that they did not meet, and that's standard 7. Be consistent with the intent and purpose of the zone in which it is proposed to locate such use. And as we looked at section 29.901, which is general industrial section in the municipal code, it says this zone is intended to provide a limited development review procedure involving only developer and staff coordinated efforts to satisfy the planning and permit requirements. This district applies to those areas where there is a need to provide a desirable industrial environment and to promote the economic viability of a type generally not appropriate for or compatible with retail sales areas. And then it says a site plan review process is required to assure such development and intensity of use in a way that assures safe, functional, efficient, and environmentally sound operations. So our conclusion was that the general industrial zoning designation, which is the appropriate zoning for a land use designation of general industrial, requires a site plan review process, which has not occurred for this special use permit application. Staff has determined that paving is required for the vehicle areas per the standards of the zoning ordinance. And so there are alternatives in your report, and our recommendation as staff is alternative number 1. The zoning board of adjustment can approve the special use permit for a temporary 1-year approval of a yard waste collection and transfer facility at 400 and 220 Friel Drive, based on the findings of fact and conclusion stated herein, with the following conditions. A, general operations on weekdays and weekends as described within the application, and up to 5 large event days. B, that the approval of the use be allowed through May 1st, 2022. All yard waste, material, equipment, and temporary structures shall be removed from the site and the site restored to its current or better condition within 60 days of the end of the permit. And C, if the site is sought for use again beyond the 1-year allowance, the applicant will need to seek a new special use permit for the use and meet all site development standards related to the use, including but not limited to the required paving of driveways, parking, and landscaping. All future approvals will be subject to meeting current zoning requirements for use of the site in any capacity, permanent or temporary. So that's our recommendation. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Ray. Are there any questions for staff?
Yeah, why 1 year, temporary 1-year approval when he has basically a temporary contract for 3 years?
Well, when you look at the 3-year contract, in addition to 3+ years he's already had, it's no longer a temporary use. It's I don't know how we could find that would be considered temporary. There's no other use or area of the city where we found that to be the case. And you did grant the appeal for temporary use, and so that's why we are recommending the 1 year. Anything beyond that, would need to meet the standards in the code for site plan review and required improvements on the site.
Are there other questions?
I have a question. Since I missed the last meeting, I read through the minutes, and I was at the previous meeting where we discussed this case, but was granting of the appeal only valid for 1 year then? Is that appeal only valid for a certain amount of time?
The appeal is for a special use permit for temporary yard waste collection and transfer site located at 220 and 400 Field Drive. It has the word temporary in there, temporary yard waste collection and transfer. So our position is anything beyond that 1 year, it's no longer temporary.
Okay, thank you.
Neely, I have a question.
Yeah.
So Ray, when you say it's not harmonious with the character of the other properties, Ray, I've been down there. That's an industrial area. It's purely industrial. I mean, and I'm pretty sure from looking around that there's a lot of other places that don't have paved entrances and so forth. I understand the current need for that, but I mean, we approved this on the temporary basis. I just feel like that's a backdoor way to throw that back in there. But either way, well, the temporary nature of it obviously is the question we need to answer. And then when you're reading 29.901, obviously consistent with the intent, I think if you look at section 2, it says, use category, waste processing and transfer. This definitely, to me, would qualify for waste processing and transfer. And in that, it doesn't even mention, it only says that you need a special use permit. It doesn't even say it needs a minor site development plan. So I'm not sure how the two, section 1 and section 2, then coincide. It seemed to conflict. Can you clarify that for me?
Yeah. Well, first of all, on the area, I looked at some past site plans that were approved since the last meeting. And all of them I checked on Field Drive required paving. At 401 through 415 Field Drive, which is across the road at the other yard waste site, when that was approved, they were required to pave a parking area and drive aisle. And just to the south, there's 3 commercial buildings, and they all were required to pave parking areas. And at the salvage yard, at the south end of Field Drive, it's actually addressed as 1816 Southeast 5th Street. They needed a special use permit for the salvage yard, and they had to provide 41 paved parking spaces. And then Schaefer's Auto Body at the north end of Field Drive, they also had to pave parking spaces along Field Drive and do a paved parking lot along Lincoln Way. So there's a lot of precedent for requiring paving on Field Drive. All these other projects I mentioned, they have paved surfaces, and they were required to have a site plan and paved surfaces, and they're in the general industrial zone. And so what we're saying is to be consistent with the standards in the general industrial zone, a site plan and paving improvements are required. If you're talking about anything under other than what the board approved last time with the temporary use of the site. We're not saying the use is not an appropriate use. It's an appropriate use in the GI zone, but not without site improvements, as is the case for other uses in the GI zone.
Great.
So-
Also point to the other section of the code on special use permits, just generally requiring.
Mhm.
Plans.
Say that again?
Isn't under this special use section of the code, special use permit section of code, that's where it says they all require minor site development plans.
So, yes, yep, yes, it does.
So it's not in the general industrial section of the code, it's in the special use permit section of the code.
But what I'm saying is the uses in general industrial, they all have to comply
Okay,
with the site plan and you know, there's another section about minor site development plans, and they're required to provide a minor site development plan and do the code requirements for site improvements.
okay. Chad, did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it's a little misleading because they all require then a site plan. It's just whether you need more or less. So I think it should probably change that little matrix to clarify that. Because if I read this straight up, I would be, hey, all I needed to get a special use permit to have a waste processing. And I'm not sure what purpose any parking would serve in this site. I'm not, based on what the intended use of it is. It's not like there's an office you go into and conduct business and would have to park. Usually it's pull up, dump your stuff off and leave.
Well, except when it's not free days, you have to pay.
Yes.
And there needs to be a place where you park and go in and pay.
Yeah, but I don't think there's even a building on the site. If I'm correct, I might be wrong.
There's not, but they could, bring in a temporary, I think they had planned on, and maybe that plan has changed, but they had planned on bringing in like an RV or something to use as an office.
So in the alternative, I'm just making sure that we do require some kind of aggregate to be put down. Obviously, you said something about maintaining what would be considered the driveway or the pathways.
So it sounds like what you're actually wanting to do is grant a variance to what is required by our code. And there's a whole separate process for that.
Yeah, that's what.
And there's also a process for him to request a text amendment for the particular use that we're talking about. I don't want to confuse what is before you today. I don't think you can grant a variance during this process.
Right, but I'm saying the suggestion of staff almost does that, because if it's temporary, we're not requiring other things, and we've already granting the special use permit with the conditions, we in effect are granting the variance to what the requirements are. Just
Well, you appeal, you as the board approved the appeal last time.
And the appeal language was we're essentially, because it's a temporary use, not requiring a minor site development plan and paving.
Right.
Okay. I just had a clarification on the difference between other temporary uses like cell towers and asphalt plants that we've seen. Do those not need to be removed in between conditional use permits typically, unless they get an extension?
Yeah, they're typically approved for about a year,
And then
or less than a year, sometimes less than a year.
Mm-hmm. And then they're completely removed from the site, right?
Yes, and the site's restored to the way it was before they were there.
And then, do you know what the other, if you've been looking into this, the other longest term temporary permit we've issued is? Is it just generally a year besides this one that we've issued permits for?
It would probably be either the temporary cell towers or the batch plant.
And those have been issued for a year max, typically.
A year max. And those are the only ones in the code that actually authorize a temporary approval.
Are there other questions for Ray? Okay, now it's time for the applicant to speak to their request. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you.
Could you state your name and address, and then I'll swear you in?
My name is Doug McCray. My principal business residence is Green RU, 225 Little Wall Lake Road, Blairsburg, Iowa. I am an Ames resident, and my residence is 913 Tennyson Avenue.
Do you swear to tell the truth?
I'm sorry?
Do you swear to tell the truth?
Yes.
Thank you.
I've listened to the conversation and the questions between staff and members of the board. I was taking notes as things went along. I would contend, first of all, as Mr. Snyder said, that our plan is harmonious with the area involved. I will also state that we did submit a site plan. That site plan was submitted in accordance with the application package provided by the city. It says show traffic routes and parking, and that's what we did. Nothing was stipulated in any of the application packages that it needed to be done formally by a computer-generated printout. The site app plan that was submitted by a licensed surveyor. Granted, it was submitted in 2006, but nothing has been done to change the physical characteristics of the site, nor is anything planned to change the physical characteristics of the site. As the discussion has clearly been said, the issue becomes what is temporary and what is not. It's not in city code, so it's a subjective opinion at this point. That becomes a challenge for everybody. And until it's in city code, it's going to be open to subjective interpretation. Now, when it comes to parking, it was mentioned by Mr. Anderson that several sites were required to pave their sites as part of their permit. Mr. Anderson failed to specify what they were required to pave it with. Our first use permits required us to pave, if you will, the entryway with aggregate. If you go down Friel Drive, yes, Schaefer's has hard copy pavement, if you will, but they're also on the 150 to 200 feet of paved Friel Drive. No one else that I'm aware of, and I've been down there a lot, have any paved entryways. I also want to point out that I think it is a double standard at this point, and I think the reason it's a double standard is you're directing the landowner to improve, redevelop his site, even though the city has no plans to develop Friel Drive. That is one of the real cruxes of this whole situation. I have little doubt that the ordinance was written in good faith. It just wasn't written with an eye toward Friel Drive. And Friel Drive is probably, quite honestly, the only unpaved road in the city of Ames. So now you're basically forcing landowners to do something that the city itself won't do. Lastly, I want to go and reference to you where it talks about parking in the general industrial zone. Table 29.406, parent 2, minimum off-street parking requirements. Under the general industrial zone, it talks about industrial service, manufacturing and production, resource production and extraction. And it says warehouses. It does not talk about waste transfer stations or yard waste sites, even though other documentation in the code specifically addresses that. Mr. Anderson alluded to the fact that we were going to bring a building in to act as a temporary office. That is not the case. We never have, and we do not intend to do that. That then, by definition, becomes a development or an improvement to the site, even if it's temporary. And then we would have to submit this minor site development plan. I understand that. The whole gist is there is no intent to do anything to the site other than use it as a drop site and a transfer station for yard waste. The city's recommendation is for a year. I understand why the city wants that for a year. It really doesn't do anybody any good. Well, it does people some limited good. But the rationale is beside me. And I would ask that the board specifically consider a 3-year temporary permit with the provisions listed in alternative 1A and alternative 2C to be part of that approval. I'll be happy to answer any questions that anybody has.
Are there questions for the applicant? Okay, thank you very much. We'll come back to you if we've got any further questions. Now it's time to open the public hearing. Are there members of the public who wish to comment on this request? Please raise your hand on Zoom.
No one's raising their hand.
Okay. If you're on a phone, I think it's *9.
There's no one.
Okay, we'll close the public hearing. Are there further questions for the applicant or staff, or does either wish to add anything additional?
I would like to respond to the comments from the applicant.
Sure.
Okay. He mentioned that I didn't specify what the paving material was, but it's concrete. In every case, it was concrete for the parking areas. There's one site at 406 and 48 Freel Drive, just south of this site, where there was a driveway that used an alternate material that was approved with an earlier site plan. And so that's not concrete, but that's the only exception. Everything else, in fact, the parking spaces for that same site are concrete. The parking spaces for the, and drive aisle for the yardway site across the road, they're concrete. The 41 parking spaces for the salvage yard are concrete, and Schaefer's Auto Body parking spaces are concrete. Freel Drive is not the only unpaved road in the city of Ames. There are several other unpaved roads, and so it's not unique. There are other areas where there's paved surfaces that access a gravel road. The applicant talked about this becoming a development by bringing in a building. And if you don't bring in a building, it's not a development. Well, the code doesn't really use that terminology of development. That's why I was reading section 29.303, where it says, land, buildings, and structures regulated. No land, building, or structure shall be used. No building or structure shall be erected, and no building or structure shall be moved, added to, or altered except in conformity with this ordinance. So in that first part again, no land shall be used. Doesn't matter if there's a building or not. In this case, if there were a site plan, it would require paving improvements. And we are supporting the 1 year. The applicant's proposal to go 3 years with no paving improvements. It's our position that that's not even an option. That's not even an option without a site plan and the required improvements. That the board doesn't even have that option to approve that.
Why don't we have that option?
Because that's, the code requires a site plan and it requires improvements as part of the site plan. And you'd be approving this use for another 3 years. It's already gone over 3 years. Now you're looking at over 6 years without a site plan and improvements. And it's not allowed by the regulations. It's not allowed by the code. And as Jane was mentioning, this isn't a variance. This is a special use permit. So you have to follow the rules in the code.
Sounds like to me council needs to define temporary.
I believe that's an option in the staff report. It encourages the applicant to pursue, a text amendment.
Yeah, you're not approving a variance, and you also can't change the text in the code. That's a city council that's responsible for that. So you can act on the special use permit.
So the applicant has to go to the city council and say, hey, you need to define temporary? Even though staff at the last council meeting took to the council, changed the voting requirements, if there's only 3 members, 2 makes it pass.
Yes, staff can take text amendments to the council, and the applicant, he could write a letter to the city council requesting that the code be changed. There'd be a text change. But what I'm saying is the board can't change the text.
No, we can't change the ordinance.
The board can also make a request that council take a look at the language as well. So there would be 3 different avenues to take this to council.
Ray, how long does a typical text amendment process take?
Oh, probably 2 to 3 months.
Okay, so it's reasonable to get that done in a year.
It's a change in the ordinance, so that means there has to be 3 readings of the ordinance, which could be done in 1 meeting or as many as 3 meetings.
If they weigh the rules, but yeah, it could take. It's set up to take three readings, 1 reading in each meeting.
But the 3 months is because there's some back and forth and working with staff, and doesn't go to your planning and zoning commission?
Yeah, it's right. It has to go to the planning and zoning commission first, and it has to be drafted by staff, and Staff has to be directed by the council to put it together. And by the time it's all said and done, it's about 3 months later.
Are there other questions for the applicant or staff?
I appreciate the time everybody's putting into this. This is, Mr. Anderson has stated that these areas are paved. I'd sure like to know where the 41 parking lots are around the corner of Friel Drive and I think it's 4th Street, 5th Street, 6th Street.
Yeah, South 5th Street, they're behind the fence.
Yeah, well, behind the fence.
Yeah.
I challenge that there's any paint that's concrete there. If it was, it didn't last very long. But there are some frustrations rising here, and Mr. Anderson is pointing out a section 303 of the code which says land use and needs to be approved with a special use permit. We've done that. We followed the application package that the city provided for the special use permit package. The documentation was all correct. They have some concerns. I raised that, or I understand that. The bottom line, I think, here is, I don't know, I think everybody loses here. No matter what happens, everybody loses here. Most importantly, the people that lose here are the residents of the city of Ames. And with that, I'm going to leave it. I'm going to stop my comments, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. If there's no further discussion, go ahead, Rick.
I'd like to add one more thing. When we accept an application and determine that it's complete, that's in terms of quantitatively, does it have the items listed in the code? And then we review it, and it's reviewed by the Development Review Committee in a site plan, and the Development Review Committee determined that what he submitted as a site plan was not acceptable. And it's a site plan that was drawn for a different use on this site. It was drawn for a salvage yard. And so what they did is they took that site plan from 2006 and drew blue lines on it to show the traffic pattern and called that a site plan for this special use permit, which doesn't meet any of the requirements. And the signature of the surveyor that prepared the site plan would not apply to the way it is now.
And again, I would say that there was nothing in the documentation or in code that says that the site plan cannot have a pen drawing of traffic flow on it. The surveyor is still a licensed surveyor in the state of Iowa. The site plan, in our estimation and opinion, granted is 16, 17 years old, but there have been no material changes to that plan since it was generated. It's still valid.
Okay, I'm just gonna go ahead here and say that I think we waived for this temporary use of this specific site, submittal of a site plan last meeting. So I don't believe there is a site plan submitted, and we've already discussed that and taken action on that. And so I think the question before the board is, since we have waived the submittal of a site plan, are we able to conclude and find that those two findings, those two standards that staff couldn't find are met by allowing a 1-year temporary use with other conditions. And I do have one question for you, Mr. McCray. Are you open to pursuing a text amendment or, writing a letter to City Council to request this definition of temporary use in the 1-year period?
We certainly are. Unfortunately, as Mr. Anderson has said, it's got to go through the planning department, and that then is going to become the challenge if they're not supportive of it. I can submit anything I want to City Hall, and they're going to turn it back to the planning department for comment and through the zoning board. And I'm happy to do that, okay? For whatever reason, I'm not going to say that. I'm going to take that back. I will do whatever it takes to make this happy and to provide a space for the residents of the city of Ames to dispose of their yard waste this year and in whatever it takes in coming years. I'm always looking for a different location. But as you well know, land around the city of Ames is a premium. And there is really the odds of finding anything different in this year or next year or the following year don't exist. I wouldn't even want to bet on it. This site is perfectly suited for this endeavor. If I have to do other work, I'll do other work.
On the finding another site, so you are looking for another site. I know you said you don't think it's feasible in the next year to find one, but does that affect your contract if you were to find another site in the next year? Could you move and maintain that contract?
It does not. It is not a contract. Okay? Understand that the city put out an RFP. We responded to the RFP. Part of the submission was that the applicant was to get all of the required permits. We put in our RFP that we were pursuing the permit. Problem the city has is there was only one applicant. There was only one bid.
Hold on. I'm referencing, you said the 3-year period would be appropriate because that coincides with an agreement. So there's no agreement?
It is an agreement with a purchase order. It is not a contract.
And that's a 3-year agreement with purchase order.
The pricing was for 3 years. Okay. Ideally, that is the 3-year. If you want to call it a contract, I'm not a lawyer, but at this point, it's an agreement. It's not necessarily a contract. If either party were to, if you will, try to terminate it, there is no contractual law that would be followed that I'm aware of. Again, I'm not an attorney.
Okay, thank you. Are there any further discussion questions, or should we have a motion?
I do have a question, sorry. So you mentioned, Mr. McCray, that this site is a great site for your business. Is there a reason why it can't permanently stay there? Or you're not looking to permanently stay in that location? Does that need a different, are there different requirements that need to be met for you to stay there? Or is it the same process that we're going through? Therefore, it just doesn't sound like, if there isn't a contract in place and there's no potential other places that could be beneficial for your business to move to, then it doesn't, to me, that doesn't sound temporary. I mean, it sounds like it would be better suited for it to permanently stay where it's at if it's allowed to be there. And I understand that your thoughts are that you don't know how long you'll be there for, but
Yes, ma'am. To answer your question, we are working with the city of Ames to, as part of their solid waste management plan, to develop an organic waste diversion program that would take organic waste. And we already participate with the city in a food waste diversion program. That food waste diversion program right now brings in roughly, on average, 800 to 1,000 pounds of food waste a week that we then haul down to Southeast Iowa and compost. The long-term goal with the city is to make this food waste diversion program, the quote organic waste diversion program, divert roughly 30% of the solid waste that's generated into the city and convert it into compost. To do that, you need yard waste or a bulking agent. So to do that organic waste diversion and composting at Friel Drive isn't really feasible because it's in a floodplain, and I certainly wouldn't want to approve that given the potential for a flood. You know, if yard waste or wood waste goes down the river, no big deal. Food waste is a different story. We are looking along the old US 30 corridor at some sites. We have been in negotiations with them. Unfortunately, people with biofuels are still a strong thing, or companies like Dow and other biofuels companies are coming in because those facilities exist already and snatching that land up. So we're looking further and further out. Problem is, as we go further and further out, now we've got to change zoning from agriculture or whatever it may be to try to do that. This is kind of like, think of it this way. Everybody wants to have fossil fuels, but they don't want the refinery in their backyard. Everybody wants to become green, but they don't want it necessarily in their backyard. So we are looking at trying to identify other places. That's the challenge. So the long and the short of it is, if we find a place where we can do organic waste diversion, we'll leave the Ames Friel Drive site. Excuse me.
thank you.
There's no other discussion. We could have a motion. I'll make a motion of alternative one with the 1 year approval. I think that gives the applicant and city staff or the Board of Adjustment time to request a definition of temporary, like through a text amendment or code amendment process.
I think the key for me was that when we asked last time about his prior special use permits, there was really no limit put on it. So if it was like, okay, you're going to get this, and then if temporary wasn't really defined. So when we do this, if we just say it's a 1 year, this is like the last, to me, it was just part of like a due process where he's given notice then, like, okay, this is the last, extension of this, or if that's what you want to call it. This is 1 year, and then it does become, in our minds as the board, then permanent, and then he can plan for that. Either he plans for the development of the site, talks to the landowner, figures out what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, how they're going to pay for it, even involve the city if he needs to, if it's an issue of, hey, now I'm being required to this by you, but you still want to keep me here, so pay me more, or, make it worth the while. How do we offset that? So I think that's where I was at last time, because I asked the question, hey, did they say this was the limit? Then you get to use the special use permit, but now we're giving you, basically, because it's temporary, not having to comply with this site development plan and the paving requirements. But if you extend beyond this, then it turns into permanent. I think we can define it but the issue is that he needs to have notice. He needs to know, and then he can plan accordingly. My issue before was he was not given any real notice. And so I think that answers kind of Layla's question. I don't want to speak for you, but it was kind of like, okay, how, when do we say this is then permanent, or it's been there long enough? I think we say that, so I'm willing to give him that, in fact, that he didn't know, but now it's like, yeah, you're on notice. You get a 1 year special use permit. And then, I think that was Ray's concern in this too, is okay, what is reasonable? To me, it's not necessarily a matter of time, which that can be a factor, but also the notice. So that's my 2 cents on it. And hopefully 1 year is enough. I think if he could come back and show that he's taken steps to do certain things, but he just needs a little bit more time, but he's made a good faith effort, that could be considered. But I think we can consider that later, because I know there are certain limitations sometimes that are out of his control. But I think as far as the board's concerned here tonight, I think the consideration would be, okay, is 1 year long enough? If we consider that's long enough to be able to push forward on the issues, whether it's addressing the issue of temporary or figuring out, okay, I'm going to have to do this site development, and how am I going to pay for it to make it economically viable to stay, and it's worth something to the city, then that's what he needs to do. And that's kind of my quandary in this. It's like, the city, obviously it's a beneficial good for the city. They've extended this contract, but now the city's like almost, with the other hand, kind of saying, okay, well, now we're going to take away. So they give something, but then they take away. And I understand the need for the zoning and compliance with that. So that's where I want to be even-handed in this and just say, okay, obviously my stance would be we should prove the conditional use permit, but then it's like, okay, how long is that extension? I think 1 year is fair at this point in time, because this is not a new issue, I don't think. So that's where I would go forward with the motion, is for the 1 year temp and consider that. And then this is the temporary.
Are you seconding?
I'm seconding. Sorry, that was a long second.
No, I really appreciate it.
Well, my tendency is be equitable and split the baby in half and just say 2 years. But I think in all the discussion, I think that's where I open the door a little bit to say, hey, if he puts a good faith effort in, I don't think any of us are going to be kind of punitive and say, well, nope, we're not absolutist on that, obviously, because we're giving you the conditional, or the permit. So that's my second.
Chad, are you adding a friendly amendment that if he shows good faith effort, that it can be extended?
No, I think that was just my editorial comment on how I feel like we should operate as a board. We are dealing with people that live in this city, and they're our neighbors. And this, on top of that, is something that is a benefit to the city. It's almost like it's a part of the public works, it's just contracted out. But that doesn't alleviate the responsibility. Ultimately, I just feel like it needs to be clearly defined and set forward, and so everybody knows what the expectations are, and there's no ambiguity going forward, because that's what's fair. So we know what's expected, we know what needs to be done, and then no more, you know, is this temporary, not temporary? Nope, this is it. And so if he wants to stay on that site, then he's going to have to understand and not wait, you know, till a month till this expires and go, oh, well, yeah, I don't have any plan. Well, okay, that's not a good faith effort. If he's almost got to work the two ends against itself right now. He can work on the city and figuring out there, but he can also work on the site development, and it's not mutually exclusive.
I think that's a really good point about you can work on the site development as well. You know, I think at the March meeting when this first came up, we discussed, you know, if you submitted a site plan that met, you know, was prepared by a licensed individual meeting the city code, I think at that point, there was an option for the city engineer to even look at paving alternatives at that point, not necessarily not paving, but alternative materials.
Yeah.
Is that right? Do you guys remember that correctly?
There were, I think we're getting a little far from where we're at with the motion at hand here. I do want to say that I do believe that I think we're getting to something. We have a motion at hand that I think meets the applicant's needs initially for tonight. I think it does put some responsibility potentially on the city as well to meet the needs and the residents of the city, because let's not lose sight of the fact that this will be put out in utility bills, that this is something that is available to the residents of the city as a city service. So the city is going to somewhat, I don't want to necessarily put words in their mouth and say take credit for this, but they certainly publicize it as a service to the residents of the city and stuff. And it is something that a city of this size, I think the residents expect. Certainly if we have a derecho, they're going to come in and help us like they did in the past. But in typical years, we still have yard waste and stuff, and people are having yard waste right now that they need to deal with and are unable to deal with. So this has probably gone on long enough that it needs to be dealt with. I don't want to put a final resolution for what the city council needs to do, because they have a purpose that they need to do. But I'm trying to go right up against saying that the city has a responsibility in this as well, as I believe does the applicant. And I think the applicant said that they're willing to do something on their part. And we need some expectations on this. And I would like to hopefully see, I think we're seeing we're putting forth something that buys a year for everybody to come together and serve the citizens of Ames, which is hopefully what we're all here for.
I personally would like to advocate for a 2-year or even a 3-year, because based on what the applicant stated, that his agreement, not contract, with no contractual language, he is even more in a temporary position to receive money from the city, because it sounds like it's just a budget item that can be changed with one public hearing, and he could be out of the budget, within 2 months. So I really think he should be allowed for a longer time period to budget the money from the city to do the improvements needed for the site plan.
Yeah, I think the 1 year for me seems adequate to determine what the requirements will be.
Amelia,
Point of order,
the motion
we have a
has
motion, so we have a discussion, correct? We're at discussion point.
Okay, we're at the discussion point,
We're
yeah.
at discussion.
He's receiving 15 from the city every year, but to do the paving required, it's going to cost him $9,000 of that. So I would say he needs more than 1 year's worth of income from the city to be able to afford to do the improvements that the city deems required, or that staff deemed required.
And I don't think our 1 year is necessarily saying you've got to do the improvements within the year. We've just got to figure out what's going to be required and then do the CUP and after that.
I think too, Ron, if if we don't limit it, then there's no urgency, sorry, Doug, on your part, nor on the city council's part. Then they're like, well, let's just kick it down farther. If the city knows, understands, hey, by next year at this time, you could lose your yard waste management processor because you've kind of excluded him by this, then it's like, okay, we need to take care of this. And they would then work with him. I think you've got to have, sometimes you got to have that, you know, I'm a stick and carrot person. I use both. So there's a stick, but then, you know, there needs to be the carrot too. So it's the benefit for the city looking at that as far as the carrot, and then, okay, but then the stick is, hey, there's a time limit on this and it's got to get done. I know there's probably higher priorities. We're looking at things, you know, but this is in front of us. This is, you know, you know, yeah, I think there's a need for it, obviously. If not, then we're looking at possibly having like a county dump site where you got to go, you know, wherever there might be a spot somewhere in the county. I'm not even sure, because I haven't bothered to have to do that because I can take it in town here. But, you know, and I'm sure that the reclamation center doesn't want stuff showing up in there that shouldn't be, and that causing an issue. So I mean, there's a lot of motivation here. I think this is where, my issue was that as long as you have notice, then you know what you're aiming for and what the requirements are. It's pretty clear at this point what the requirements are going to be. Hopefully then it can just be worked out.
I have a question for Jane. Since the key thing in this entire hearing is the definition of temporary, when we make the decision on this motion, can we add a motion to this meeting to request that the city departments take a look at the definition of temporary?
I guess I think you can certainly send a letter to city council as a board asking for movement on that. I'm not sure that you have the authority to request that staff do it on your behalf. Does that make sense?
Well, I understood the Board of Adjustments can send to the zoning board a request to look at a section of the ordinance.
Sure.
There is no section in the ordinance that defines temporary. Is that the same thing?
I would say that you would want to use the same process if you're wanting that you're talking about, to send it to either planning or to have council direct staff to make the change in the ordinance.
So to bring it to the council to change.
Right.
Yeah.
I think in the past, we have done a letter to council requesting that they direct staff.
But do we need a motion to do that letter?
No, I don't believe so. We have
Or a consensus at least?
We could take a volunteer.
But I think we need to deal with what we have we have a motion on the table we need to deal with first.
Okay.
If there's
Call the motion.
if there's no further discussion, we could have a roll call vote on the motion, which is alternative 1. A roll call vote, please, Renee. I think you're muted.
Yeah.
I hope she didn't fall asleep.
Sorry, I couldn't get unmuted. Okay. Schneider,
Aye.
Bowers,
Aye.
Amar,
Aye.
Shoneman,
Aye.
Shapar.
No.
Okay, and the motion's declared approved. Anyone who wishes to appeal this decision to a court of record may do so within 30 days of the filing of the decision. Okay. We can have a motion to adjourn.
I will make a motion to adjourn.
We aren't going to discuss the definition.
I think we need to put that on an agenda if we're gonna discuss something, or a letter. Is that right, Jane?
Probably, yes.
Okay. So Ray or Renee or Jane, could you put an item on the agenda just to have us draft a paragraph for next meeting to email the city council? Maybe bring some ideas, guys.
And then at the risk, I'll write the letter.
Thank you.
Um,
Okay.
Yeah, I'll probably dual it to the zoning board and to the city council. We'll just shoot them the same letter, and I'll probably couch the issue in the context, because I think the context matters, but ultimately it's, yeah, we do need to kind of have an idea.
Okay.
I'll do that. You can put that down.
Thank
And
you.
you'll copy us, or?
Yeah, I'll just try to, somebody shoot me a reminder.
We'll put it on the agenda, right?
Yeah, put it on the agenda and then make sure, yeah.
Okay, I can do it. I can remind you.
All right.
Great, thanks. So we have a motion to adjourn by Amar. I'll second. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Okay, and we're adjourned. Thank you,
All
everyone.
right.